March 15, 44 BC. The floor of the Roman Senate. A dictator falls. For 2,000 years, we have been taught this was a heroic defense of democracy. But in the cold light of geopolitics, this was not a rescue mission. It was a cartel assassination. To understand Julius Caesar, we must strip away the myth. Rome in the 1st century BC was not a functioning republic. It was a failed state, controlled by a corrupt oligarchy of billionaires. Caesar did not destroy the system. The system had already destroyed itself. We look at the Rubicon River and see a tyrant's ambition, but true history requires skepticism. Look at the logistics. Look at the Senate's demands. Caesar was backed into a geopolitical corner. He didn't cross the river to conquer Rome. He crossed it to survive. Let's analyze the architecture of corruption. The Senate was not a parliament. It was a board of directors. They bought elections, they extracted wealth from the provinces, and they used the military as a private security force. The republic was an illusion maintained for PR. Caesar realized a dangerous truth. You cannot reform a cartel from the inside. You can only dismantle it through asymmetric leverage. But to gain that leverage, he needed two things the Senate lacked: unquestionable military loyalty and the absolute devotion of the working class. This brings us to the Gallic Wars. Most historians treat it as a military campaign. In reality, it was a 10-year public relations masterpiece. Caesar wasn't just conquering Gaul. He was building an independent financial and military ecosystem outside the Senate's control. Every victory, every letter sent back to Rome was calculated propaganda. He wrote the Gallic Wars not for the elite, but for the plebeians. He was bypassing the traditional media, speaking directly to the masses. He was engineering a cult of personality funded by conquest. But warfare is a game of calories and logistics. Conquering Gaul required feeding 50,000 men in hostile territory. Caesar mastered the supply chain. He proved that he wasn't just a politician, he was a systems engineer. His soldiers realized their survival depended entirely on him. By 50 BC, the Senate was terrified, not because Caesar was a criminal, but because he was competent. He had an army that was fiercely loyal to him, not the state. The oligarchs realized their monopoly on power was facing an existential corporate takeover. Pompey the Great, Caesar's former ally, became the Senate's sword. They issued an ultimatum. Caesar must disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen. In the language of geopolitics, this was a demand for unconditional surrender. It was a trap. If Caesar returned without his legions, he would face fake trials, bankruptcy, and assassination. The Senate didn't want justice. They wanted to neutralize a rival. They left him with a binary choice: submit and die, or fight and become a traitor. This is the calculus of the Rubicon. January 49 BC, a small, muddy river separating his province from Italy. Crossing it with an army was treason, but not crossing it was suicide. Caesar applied asymmetric logic. When the system is rigged, you must break the board. Alea iacta est. The die is cast. This wasn't a reckless gamble. It was a preemptive strike. Caesar knew the Senate was slow, arrogant, and unprepared for a rapid kinetic mobilization. He moved with terrifying velocity. He didn't march on Rome. He blitzed it. The Senate expected a long negotiation. Instead, they woke up to find Caesar's vanguard hours away. Panic destroyed the government. The oligarchs fled the city, leaving the treasury behind. Caesar took Rome without a single siege. It was a masterpiece of psychological paralysis. But here is where the propaganda breaks down. The Senate claimed they were fleeing to save the Republic. In reality, they were fleeing to save their assets. They abandoned the citizens, proving Caesar's core argument. The Senate cared only for itself. The mask had fallen. Caesar did not declare himself emperor. He played the role of the reluctant savior. He pardoned his enemies, a tactic known as clementia. This wasn't mercy, it was weaponized forgiveness. By sparing his rivals, he publicly humiliated them and destroyed their moral authority. To the Roman public, the oligarchs looked like cowards, and Caesar looked like a statesman. He understood that in a civil war, the ultimate battle is not for territory, it is for legitimacy. He was fighting a war of perception, and he was winning. The civil war raged across the Mediterranean, from Spain to Greece to Egypt. Caesar's strategy was consistent: speed, audacity, and total disruption of the enemy's decision cycle. He forced Pompey to fight on his terms. He was a master of chaos engineering. At the Battle of Pharsalus, Pompey had twice the men and all the Senate's money. Caesar had starving veterans and tactical genius. He anticipated Pompey's cavalry charge, hid a reserve line, and broke the elite strike force. It wasn't a battle, it was a slaughter of arrogance. Pompey fled to Egypt, seeking refuge, but geopolitics has no room for sentiment. The boy king Ptolemy XIII, seeing the shift in global power, had Pompey beheaded. A calculated move to appease the new master of the world. The old republic died on a foreign beach. When Caesar arrived and was presented with his rival's fate, he wept. Was it genuine grief or a calculated display for the historians? In the realm of Realpolitik, it doesn't matter. He established the narrative. He was the unifier. The Senate were the instigators. By 45 BC, the kinetic war was over. Caesar returned to Rome as the undisputed apex predator. He began a massive restructuring of the state: debt relief, calendar reform, public works. He was doing what the Senate had refused to do for a century: governing. But efficiency breeds enemies. The surviving oligarchs, pardoned by Caesar, realized their wealth was secure, but their power was gone. They could no longer exploit the provinces. Caesar had turned their private playground back into a state. For the elite, this was intolerable. They began to plan. They couldn't defeat his armies, so they targeted his biology. They wrapped their treason in the language of liberty. They called themselves the liberators. But history demands we read between the lines. This wasn't a revolution, it was a reactionary coup. They understood the geopolitics of treason. If you kill the CEO, the corporation panics. They believed that removing Caesar would magically restore the corrupt republic they loved. They were about to learn that you cannot assassinate a paradigm shift. The Ides of March was approaching.
Marcus Brutus and Cassius, the architects of the Ides of March. They convinced themselves they were saving the Republic, but geopolitics does not care about your feelings. They were not defending liberty, they were defending their financial monopoly. They were billionaires protecting their cartel. But here is the intelligence failure. Caesar had spies, he knew the plots. So why did he dismiss his Spanish bodyguards? Was it arrogance or was it fatigue? When you are the apex predator, the sheer weight of maintaining power becomes its own slow poison. March 15th, the Senate House of Pompeii. 60 senators, 23 strikes. This was not a battle, it was a frenzied mob execution. The oligarchs believed that by removing the man, they would remove the problem. They thought the republic would magically reset. They were catastrophically wrong. They rushed into the streets with their daggers raised, shouting liberty. They expected the citizens to cheer. Instead, they were met with dead silence. This is the ultimate geopolitical miscalculation. The elites lived in an echo chamber. They didn't realize the public actually loved the dictator. You can kill a man, you cannot kill a paradigm. Caesar was a symptom of a broken system. By assassinating him in public, they didn't save the republic, they created a martyr. They handed the ultimate geopolitical weapon to the men who survived him. Enter Mark Antony, the surviving loyalist. The Senate thought he was a drunken brute, a meathead. They spared him because they underestimated him. But Antony was a master of psychological warfare. He didn't use an army to destroy the liberators, he used theatrics. The funeral of Caesar. Antony took the dictator's will and read it to the public. Caesar had left his private gardens to the city and a sum of money to every Roman citizen. Antony didn't argue politics, he argued economics. He bought the mob's rage with a dead man's gold. He held up Caesar's blood-stained toga. He hacked the amygdala of the Roman people. This was pure information warfare. He bypassed logic and went straight for the tribal anger. The mob didn't want liberty anymore. They wanted revenge. The republic was burning from the inside out. The riot, the liberators, the billionaires who thought they owned the world had to flee their own city in terror. Antony won the capital without drawing a single sword. He proved that narrative control is more lethal than a legion. But nature abhors a vacuum. And geopolitics abhors it even more. With Caesar gone, a new apex predator entered the arena. Gaius Octavius, Caesar's great-nephew, 19 years old, a teenager with a weak constitution. The Senate laughed at him. Antony dismissed him. They thought he was a puppet. This is the most fatal mistake in history, underestimating a quiet heir. Octavian didn't have legions, he didn't have experience, but he had a name. Caesar's will had adopted him. In a world of warlords, legitimacy is the ultimate currency. He was the brand. Octavian marched into Rome and simply declared, "I am Caesar." He weaponized his adoption. Veterans who fought for Julius flocked to the teenager, not for his skills, but for the memory he represented. He built a private army entirely out of nostalgia. Cicero, the great orator of the Senate, saw an opportunity. He thought he could use the boy to destroy Antony and then discard the boy. He must be praised, honored, and extinguished. Cicero was playing 3D chess, but he forgot he was playing with wolves. Octavian realized the Senate would never accept him, so he flipped the board. He marched his private army on Rome and forced them to make him consul. Then he did the unthinkable. He allied with his rival, Mark Antony. The second triumvirate was born. This was not a government, it was a syndicate. Octavian, Antony, and Lepidus, 3 warlords dividing the Mediterranean like a corporate pie. But war requires capital. To fund their armies, they needed gold. So they invented the ultimate tool of state terror, the proscriptions. The proscriptions were a list. If your name was on it, you were stripped of citizenship. Anyone could kill you and claim a percentage of your wealth. They weren't just killing enemies, they were legally murdering the rich to liquidate their assets. It was monetized slaughter. And at the top of Antony's list, Cicero, the puppet master, became the prey. His hands and head were cut off and nailed to the rostra in the forum. The tongue that defended the republic was silenced, the ultimate display of censorship by steel. With their war chests full of stolen gold, the syndicate marched east. The Battle of Philippi, 42 BC, the largest clash in Roman history. Antony and Octavian against Brutus and Cassius. The Cartel against the liberators, the final breath of the Roman Republic. The liberators were crushed. Cassius and Brutus fell on their own swords. The irony, the Republic didn't die at Philippi. It had died decades earlier in the greed of the Senate. Philippi was just the autopsy. The world now belonged to two men. Antony took the east, the wealth, the grain. Octavian took the west, the tradition, the hardship. It wasn't peace, it was a cold war, a geopolitical waiting game. Two apex predators circling a single shrinking cage, and the trigger would be a queen. Antony arrived in Egypt and met Cleopatra. History calls it a great romance. Geopolitics calls it a strategic merger. Cleopatra needed Roman muscle to secure her throne. Antony needed Egyptian wealth to feed his armies. Love is just a convenient cover story for resource acquisition.
Octavian watched from Rome. He controlled the capital. He controlled the printing press of the ancient world. He began a relentless smear campaign. He didn't attack Antony the general. He attacked Antony the Roman. He painted him as a corrupted slave to an Eastern witch. This is the climax of information warfare. Octavian illegally seized Antony's secret will from the temple of the Vestal Virgins. He read it aloud. It stated Antony wanted to be buried in Egypt, leaving Roman lands to Cleopatra's children, the ultimate geopolitical betrayal. Was the will a forgery? Most likely. But in propaganda, truth is irrelevant. Only outrage matters. Octavian had framed a civil war as a holy war against a foreign invader. He weaponized xenophobia to unite Italy behind him, the ultimate smokescreen. The trap was sprung. Octavian didn't declare war on his fellow Roman. He declared war on Cleopatra. The Republic was a ghost. The empire was raking up, and the Mediterranean was about to burn one last time. The final game was set at Actium.
The build-up to Actium, 31 BC, Antony's massive dreadnoughts against Octavian's agile fleet. Antony had the sheer size, but Octavian had the logistics. He had Agrippa, a naval genius who understood that a giant ship is just a floating coffin if the crew is starving to death. Actium wasn't a heroic clash of titans. It was a methodical, logistical strangulation. Agrippa cut off Antony's supply lines from Greece and Egypt. Starvation breeds mutiny. Antony's soldiers were dying of malaria and hunger before the first arrow was fired. Warfare is won by the quartermaster. September 2, the trap closes. The fleets engage. But then the unthinkable happens. Cleopatra breaks through the blockade and flees toward Egypt. Antony abandons his men and follows her. To the romantic, this is love. To the geopolitical analyst, this is capital flight. Why did Antony flee? Because Cleopatra's ship carried the treasury. Without gold, he couldn't pay his legions. He wasn't chasing a woman, he was chasing the budget. But in doing so, he committed the ultimate sin of a commander. He abandoned the infantry. The abandonment broke the psychological spine of his army. 19 legions on land, watching their general sail away. They surrendered without a fight. Octavian won the Roman Empire not by outfighting his rival, but by cutting his purse strings. The East had fallen. Alexandria, the final siege. Antony's remaining forces evaporate into the desert. Trapped and bankrupt, he falls on his own sword. He wasn't a tragic hero. He was an over-leveraged warlord facing total liquidation. His geopolitical gamble had failed catastrophically. The cartel was finally dead. Cleopatra attempts to negotiate with Octavian. She tries to use her wealth and her presence as leverage, but Octavian is a machine, a geopolitical calculator. He is utterly immune to sentiment. He looks at the Queen of Egypt and sees only a balance sheet. Octavian needed her alive for his triumph in Rome, a conquered monarch paraded in chains to satisfy the mob. Cleopatra realized her sovereign value had dropped to zero. She was no longer a player. She was a prop, and a pharaoh does not become a trophy. The asp, a calculated suicide. By taking her own life, she denied Octavian his ultimate PR victory. She died a queen rather than a prisoner in a cage. It was her final act of asymmetric defiance. The Ptolemaic dynasty vanished into the venom. But Octavian didn't stop at the queen. Caesarion, Julius Caesar's biological son with Cleopatra, the true blood heir. Octavian had the teenager hunted down and executed. In Realpolitik, biology is a geopolitical threat. He erased the bloodline to secure the trademark. 2 Caesars are one too many. Octavian established a brutal monopoly. Egypt was not made a Roman province. Octavian made it his personal estate. He seized the Nile. He monopolized the grain supply. He literally held the stomach of Rome hostage. 29 BC, Octavian returns to Rome. The civil wars are over. The Republic is a graveyard. The oligarchs have been exterminated. He is the last warlord standing. He holds absolute military, financial, and political power. He could easily wear a crown, but he remembers the Ides of March. He remembers his adoptive father bleeding on the Senate floor. A crown attracts daggers. Absolute power displayed openly invites assassination. So, Octavian executes the most brilliant psychological operation in the history of human governance. He didn't declare a dictatorship. He stood before the Senate and declared the restoration of the Republic. He handed his emergency powers back to the state, the ultimate gap in history. He gave them the illusion of freedom while keeping the keys to the armory. It was a masterclass in illusionary democracy. He took the title Princeps, the first citizen. No throne, no purple robes. He wore simple homespun togas. He lived in a modest house on the Palatine Hill. This was supreme geopolitical camouflage.
Behind the humble facade, he maintained control of the treasury and the absolute loyalty of the legions. He built a military dictatorship disguised as a constitutional republic. He understood that men will accept tyranny as long as you don't rub their noses in the symbols of it. The Roman people willingly traded their political freedom for bread and circuses, for predictability. After a century of civil war, proscriptions, and chaos, the iron grip of a single autocrat felt like salvation. Exhaustion is the mother of submission. The Senate became a theater, a rubber-stamp parliament. They passed laws, but Octavian wrote the scripts. He allowed the elite to keep their titles and their pride while stripping them of their capacity for violence. He neutered the aristocracy with a smile. He rebranded himself. The ruthless warlord Octavian became Augustus, the revered one. He deified Julius Caesar, making himself the son of a god. He didn't just claim legal authority, he claimed divine right. He merged religion and state into a single weapon. He created the Praetorian Guard, 9 cohorts of elite soldiers stationed permanently inside Rome, the ultimate deterrent against domestic treason. The Republic's heart was now under permanent military occupation. The swords were hidden under togas, but they were always drawn.
Augustus expanded the empire not for glory, but for economic extraction. The famous Pax Romana, the Roman peace, was just a monopoly on violence. Peace was maintained by crucifying dissenters along the highways. The geopolitics of fear institutionalized into global law.
He established borders, the Rhine, the Danube. He realized that an empire overextended is an empire that collapses from within. He shifted Rome from a predatory expansionist state into a massive fortified holding company. He prioritized profit margins over triumphs. He outlived all his rivals. He outlived his friends. He ruled for 40 years. When he lay dying, his final words were reportedly, "Have I played my part well? Then applaud as I exit." He knew it was all a performance, a geopolitical stage play. The Republic was a corpse painted to look alive. Octavian didn't save Rome, he embalmed it. He created an autocratic system so stable that it survived madmen like Caligula and Nero. He built a machine designed to run on terror and bureaucracy. Next time you hear about the fall of the Roman Republic, don't mourn the loss of democracy. Mourn the brilliant, ruthless efficiency of the men who dismantled a cartel only to build a monopoly, the ultimate victory of asymmetric statecraft.
Augustus perfected the invisible dictatorship. The Senate still met, elections still happened, but the outcomes were strictly predetermined by the man who paid the legions. He realized that when populations truly believe they are free, they do not rebel. It is the ultimate cognitive cage for the masses. He understood that hard power is entirely fragile. A sword can be broken, but soft power, the absolute control of narrative, is eternal. He weaponized art and literature, hiring poets to write state-sponsored mythology. He legitimized a brutal military coup by disguising it as divine destiny. Fast forward 2,000 years, look at the modern geopolitical landscape. Are we looking at functioning republics or sophisticated oligarchies wearing the mask of democracy? The architecture of human power remains identically ruthless. The game hasn't changed, only the hardware and the PR have evolved. We still have senates, we still hold endless elections, but who truly controls the logistics? Who commands the algorithms? The billionaires of ancient Rome bought entire provinces. The corporate warlords of today buy mass data and public perception. They manage the matrix of our political reality. When a modern superpower faces an existential crisis, what actually happens? Executive power rapidly expands. Emergency mandates are quietly declared. The republic slowly and legally transforms into an empire. Because once a state learns it can bypass the law for security, the law becomes a mere suggestion. Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon River with physical swords and legions. Today, the Rubicon is crossed entirely silently, with executive orders and mass surveillance. The death of liberty isn't a dramatic assassination on a Senate floor. It is a slow, bureaucratic boiling of the societal frog. The plebeians of Rome willingly traded their liberty for bread and circuses, free food and gladiatorial blood. Today, we trade our absolute privacy and sovereign rights for convenience and entertainment. We are completely distracted by the spectacle, while our permanent chains are forged in digital silence. We furiously argue over the gladiators in the arena, while the true levers of global power are pulled in the dark by unelected factions and financial cartels. The crowd cheers for their favorite political champion, completely blind to the fact that the emperor owns both teams.
Marcus Brutus and Cassius tragically thought they could kill the system by assassinating the CEO. But the system is a geopolitical hydra. If you decapitate a modern political figure, you don't change the imperial policy. You simply change the spokesperson for the underlying corporate cartel. The real lesson of the Roman Republic's monumental collapse: a hyperpower does not die from foreign invasion, it dies from internal rot. It dies when the ruling elite no longer share the exact same economic reality as the working class. It dies of asymmetric greed. Augustus Caesar saved Rome from burning by quietly destroying its democratic soul. He created centuries of imperial stability, but at the absolute cost of sovereignty. This is the tragic trade-off of human history. To escape the terrifying chaos of freedom, we sprint enthusiastically toward the cage. In the ruthless realm of global geopolitics, there are absolutely no good guys or bad guys. There are no heroes in white togas. There are only competing interests. Caesar was a warlord. The Senate was a cartel. Augustus was a monopolist. It is the story of predators. Predators simply divide the herd. They write the laws to protect their monopoly, and they use the military-industrial complex to crush any disruptors. The Republic wasn't murdered on the Ides of March. It committed suicide through decades of legislative corruption and sheer institutional arrogance. So, the next time you hear modern politicians passionately talk about defending democracy, ask yourself, whose democracy? And more importantly, who holds the sword? Are they genuinely protecting the voice of the people, or are they fiercely protecting their profit margins from a populist threat? Do not look at their theatrical speeches. Look directly at their supply lines. Look at who actively funds their political campaigns. Look at the ledger. Follow the gold, and you will find the true emperor. The faces change, but the mathematical equations of absolute power remain exactly the same. Because the ghosts of Rome are not dead, they are actively sitting in modern parliaments, wearing tailored suits instead of silken togas. They are drafting legislation, launching preemptive wars, and dividing the global map in air-conditioned boardrooms. The oligarchic Senate is always in session. To survive in this modern world, you must adopt the mind of the historian and the cold calculation of the strategist. Stop being the blind plebeian in the arena, cheering for the bloodshed. Step back entirely. Look at the architecture of the Colosseum. See the bars. Understand that geopolitical crisis is rarely an accident. Crisis is an opportunity. It is a manufactured ladder used by the ambitious to climb directly over the Constitution. When they tell you there is an emergency, aggressively secure your liberties, because fear is the ultimate state apparatus.
Julius Caesar proved that violent action beats hesitation. The Senate proved that unmitigated greed destroys empires. Augustus proved that tyranny is widely accepted if it is heavily dressed up as peace. These are not just ancient stories, they are blueprints. They are the user manuals of human dominance. The historical cycle is unbreakable. A republic becomes corrupt. A populist rises to dismantle the corruption. The populist becomes a dictator. The dictator builds an empire. The empire slowly rots from the inside, and the cycle brutally restarts. We are spinning on a wheel forged in iron and blood. Your only true defense is knowledge, stripped of mythology, stripped of all sentimentality. You must learn to read the geopolitical landscape not through the naive lens of morality, but through the harsh, unforgiving lens of realpolitik. Only then can you clearly see the strings attached to the puppets. Let the fall of the Roman Republic be your definitive awakening. The barbarians are not waiting at the gates. The most dangerous predators already possess the keys to the city. They have always possessed them, and they are heavily counting on your distraction to silently maintain their empire. You have been watching Lessons of History. We don't tell comforting myths. We don't sell fragile hope. We aggressively dissect the anatomy of power. We decode the DNA of empires. If you want to successfully navigate the future, you must be fearless enough to autopsy the past. Stay dangerous. Stay relentlessly skeptical. Never blindly trust the manufactured narrative of the victor. Keep your eyes completely open to the shadows of power. And remember, the Rubicon is always waiting to be crossed again. This is the final lesson of history. End of transmission.